The crack of a leather belt against flesh echoed through the dilapidated cabin. As Patience, Anderson cowered in the corner, her arms raised defensively over her face. Wyoming Territory, 1878, was unforgiving in more ways than the harsh winters and scorching summers, the cruelty of her father being the most unbearable of all. "You worthless girl." Jeremiah Anderson's words slurred as he towered over his 20-year-old daughter, whiskey bottle dangling from his left hand while his right wielded the belt. "Your mother would have been ashamed to see what you've become." Patience bit her lip until she tasted blood, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her tears. Her once white dress was smudged with dirt and spotted with blood from where the belt had already struck her shoulders. The flickering light of the oil lamp cast monstrous shadows across her father's contorted face. "I did everything you asked," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. "The chores are done, supper's made. Don't talk back to me." The belt came down again, this time catching her forearm as she tried to protect herself. "You think you're so clever, but I see how you look at me, just like she did before she left." Her mother hadn't left, she'd died from pneumonia 3 winters ago. But there was no reasoning with Jeremiah when he was like this, lost in the bottom of a bottle and the fog of his own making. The sound of approaching hoofbeats was almost lost beneath the storm, but Patience heard it, a steady rhythm cutting through the night. Her father, too drunk to notice, raised the belt again. The door burst open with such force it nearly tore from its hinges. Framed against the darkness stood a tall figure, water streaming from the brim of his hat and the shoulders of his duster. "That's enough," the stranger said, his voice low and dangerous as thunder. Jeremiah spun around, stumbling slightly. "Who the hell are you to come into a man's home uninvited?" The stranger stepped into the light, revealing a weathered face with eyes as sharp and clear as a mountain lake. He couldn't have been more than 25, but there was something in his gaze that spoke of experiences beyond his years. "Name's Matthew Reid," he said, removing his hat and shaking the water from it. "And I don't make a habit of barging into folks' homes, but I don't abide seeing a man beat his kin either." Patience stared at the cowboy, unable to believe someone had actually intervened. In their remote stretch of Wyoming, neighbors kept to themselves, and her father had made certain they lived far enough from town that her cries wouldn't be heard. "This ain't your business, cowboy," Jeremiah snarled, drawing himself up to his full height, though he still had to look up at Matthew. "This is between me and my daughter." Matthew's eyes flicked to Patience, taking in her bruised face and the red welts on her arms. His jaw tightened. "I'm making it my business," he said simply. "The lady doesn't look like she wants any part of your discipline." Jeremiah lunged forward, swinging the belt wildly, but Matthew sidestepped him easily. Years of hard drinking had dulled Jeremiah's reflexes, and the cowboy caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting until the belt clattered to the floor. "I suggest you sleep it off," Matthew said, his tone leaving no room for argument as he pushed Jeremiah backward. The older man stumbled and fell heavily into his chair by the fire. "When you wake up, maybe you'll remember how a father ought to treat his daughter." Jeremiah's face flushed with anger, but the fight seemed to drain out of him as quickly as it had come. He reached for his whiskey bottle, muttering curses. Matthew turned to Patience, his expression softening. "Miss, gather what you need. You shouldn't stay here tonight." Patience hesitated, glancing at her father, who was already tipping the bottle to his lips again, lost in his personal darkness. "I don't have anywhere to go," she admitted quietly. "I've made camp not far from here," Matthew said. "It's not much, but you'll be safe there until morning. Then we can figure out what's best." She nodded slowly and moved to collect a few belongings. A shawl, a small book her mother had given her, and a change of clothes wrapped in a piece of cloth. She worked quickly, half expecting her father to rise from his stupor and stop her, but he remained slumped in his chair, the bottle now nearly empty. Matthew watched the door while she gathered her things, his hand resting casually near the holster at his hip. When she was ready, he led her outside to where his horse waited patiently in the rain. "This is Copper," he said, patting the chestnut gelding's neck. "He's sturdy enough to carry us both until we reach my camp." He helped her onto the saddle before mounting behind her. Patience had never been this close to a man who wasn't her father, and she sat stiffly, uncertain where to place her hands. "Hold onto the saddle horn," Matthew instructed gently. "I won't let you fall." As they rode away from the cabin, Patience didn't look back. The warm presence of the cowboy behind her and the steady rhythm of the horse beneath were the first comforts she'd known in years. The rain had subsided to a gentle mist by the time they reached Matthew's camp, nestled in a small grove of cottonwoods near a creek. A small fire burned beneath a canvas shelter, and a bedroll was laid out beside it. "It's not much," Matthew said as he helped her down from the horse, "but it's dry." "Thank you," Patience said, truly looking at her rescuer for the first time. His face was kind beneath its weathering, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes that belied his serious demeanor. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along. I heard the commotion while I was looking for shelter from the storm," he explained, tending to his horse before leading Patience to the fire. "Couldn't ride on knowing someone was in trouble." He offered her a blanket and set about making coffee, giving her space while still ensuring she was comfortable. Patience watched him move around the camp with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to life on the trail. "Are you passing through?" she asked, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Matthew nodded. "On my way to Laramie. I've been hired to help drive a herd to Colorado." He handed her a tin cup of steaming coffee. "What about you? You planning to go back once your pa sobers up?" Patience stared into the dark liquid, steam rising to warm her face. "I don't know," she admitted. "It wasn't always like this. After my mother died, he started drinking. At first it was just yelling, but then—" She trailed off, not needing to explain the progression to the belt and fists. "You've got family elsewhere you could stay with," she shook her head. "My mother's people are back east, but we lost touch years ago. Pa moved us out here to start fresh after the war. He fought for the Union, came back different." Matthew nodded, understanding in his eyes. "War changes a man." "My father came back from it hollow. Took years before he found himself again." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks into the night air. "But that's no excuse for raising a hand to your child." They fell into silence, the crackling of the fire and the occasional whicker from Copper the only sounds in the night. Patience felt her eyes growing heavy, exhaustion from the ordeal, and the late hour catching up to her. "You should rest," Matthew said, noticing her fatigue. "Take my bedroll." "I'll keep watch." I insist," he said firmly. "Been sleeping under the stars for weeks now. One more night won't trouble me." Too tired to argue, Patience settled into the offered bedroll, the rough wool warm against her skin. Despite the strange surroundings and the events of the evening, she felt safer than she had in years. As sleep claimed her, her last thought was of the cowboy's clear eyes, watching over her in the firelight. Morning came with birdsong and the smell of bacon frying. Patience woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until she saw Matthew crouched by the fire, turning strips of meat in a small iron pan. "Good morning," he said, offering her a smile that transformed his face, making him appear younger and more approachable. "Hungry?" Her stomach growled in response, and she realized she hadn't eaten since midday yesterday. "Yes, thank you." They ate in companionable silence. Bacon, hardtack softened in coffee, and a handful of dried apples Matthew produced from his saddlebag. Simple trail food, but to Patience, it was a feast free from fear. "What will you do now?" Matthew asked as they finished their meal. Patience looked toward the direction of her father's cabin, though it was hidden by trees and distance. "I can't go back," she said, the decision solidifying as she spoke. "But I don't have any money, nowhere to go." Matthew considered her words. Laramie's a growing town. Might be work for a young woman cooking, cleaning, maybe helping at the mercantile. "I can cook and sew," Patience offered. "And I know my letters. Ma taught me before she passed." "That's more than many can say," Matthew nodded approvingly. "If you'd like, I could escort you to Laramie. It's on my way, and traveling alone isn't safe for anyone, especially." He trailed off, but Patience understood. "Especially a young woman, especially one who might be pursued by an angry father." "I'd be grateful," she said, "but I wouldn't want to slow you down." Matthew smiled again, that transformative expression that made her heart beat a little faster. "I'm in no particular hurry. The herd won't be ready to move for another week." And so it was decided. They packed up camp efficiently, Patience helping where she could, learning the rhythm of trail life from Matthew's patient instructions. When it came time to mount up, he taught her how to sit properly behind him, her arms around his waist for balance. "Hold tight," he said, and Patience couldn't help but notice the strength beneath her fingers as they set off toward Laramie. They rode steadily throughout the day, stopping occasionally to rest copper and stretch their legs. Matthew proved to be a thoughtful companion, sharing stories of his travels across the territories, but never pressing Patience for more information than she volunteered. By mid-afternoon, they had covered significant ground, and Matthew suggested they make camp early beside a small tributary of the Laramie River. "We're making good time," he explained as he helped her down from the horse. "No need to push copper too hard. We should reach town by tomorrow afternoon." Patience found herself oddly disappointed that their journey would end so soon. There was something liberating about the open country, with nothing but the sky above, and the solid presence of Matthew beside her. As they set up camp, Matthew showed her how to build a proper fire and where to gather the best kindling. They worked together with growing ease, and Patience found herself laughing at his dry humor, a sound foreign to her own ears after so long. "You have a nice laugh," Matthew commented, the directness of his observation making her blush. "My mother used to say the same thing," she replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "There hasn't been much cause for it lately." "Well, that's a shame," he said, his eyes lingering on her face a moment longer than necessary before he turned his attention back to preparing their supper. They ate rabbit that Matthew had snared, seasoned with wild herbs Patience had helped identify. The meal was simple but satisfying, and as dusk settled around them, Patience felt a contentment she'd nearly forgotten could exist. "Tell me about your home," she asked as they sat beside the fire, the first stars appearing overhead. "Where did you grow up?" Matthew leaned back, stretching his long legs toward the warmth of the flames. "Missouri, originally. My father had a small horse farm before the war. Afterward, we moved west to start over like so many did." "And your mother," a shadow crossed his face, "lost her to cholera when I was 14. It was just Pa and me after that, until he passed 2 years ago." "I'm sorry," Patience said softly. "It was peaceful at the end," Matthew said, his voice reflective rather than sad. "He'd found his way back to himself by then, taught me everything I know about horses, about reading the land." He glanced at her. "What about your mother? What was she like?" Patience smiled, memories warming her more than the fire. "Kind, patient like her name for me. She loved to read and would save pennies to buy books whenever the peddler came through. She believed education was important, even for girls, especially for girls, she'd say. She sounds wise. She was. Pa adored her. When she died, it was like all the light went out of him. Patience poked at the fire with a stick. Sometimes I think he hates me because I look like her. Matthew was quiet for a moment. That's his burden to bear, not yours, he finally said. A man who can't face his grief without turning it to anger isn't much of a man at all. His words settled over Patience like a bomb. For years, she'd wondered what she'd done wrong, how she'd failed to be enough for her father. To hear someone this kind, strong man place the blame where it belonged loosened something tight within her chest. They talked long into the night, sharing stories and observations, discovering shared interests in nature and music. Matthew admitted to playing harmonica, though he'd left his instrument with his other belongings in Laramie. Patience confessed her love of drawing, a hobby her father had discouraged as frivolous. "I'd like to see your drawing someday," Matthew said, his voice soft in the darkness. "Maybe you will," she replied, surprised by her own boldness. When it came time to sleep, Matthew again insisted she take the bedroll while he kept watch. This time, though, Patience was less quick to agree. "You need rest too," she argued. "I don't think my father would have followed us, even if he could track us." "It's not just your father I'm concerned about," Matthew explained. "These parts can be dangerous, especially at night. There are wolves, sometimes bandits." "Then we should take turns," Patience suggested. "Wake me in a few hours and I'll watch while you sleep." Matthew looked like he wanted to protest, but eventually nodded. "All right, but I'll wake you when the moon's at its highest, not before." True to his word, Matthew gently roused Patience in the deep of night. She sat up, momentarily disoriented in the silver moonlight that bathed their camp. "All's quiet," he assured her, his voice rough with tiredness. "Just keep an ear out for anything unusual. The fire should last until morning without much tending." Patience nodded, fully awake now. "Get some rest. I'll wake you at dawn." Matthew stretched out on the ground near the fire, using his saddle as a pillow. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened, exhaustion claiming him. Patience watched him sleep, struck by how much younger he looked with his face relaxed, the perpetual alertness momentarily suspended. The night was peaceful, with only the occasional hoot of an owl or distant howl of a coyote to break the silence. Patience found herself enjoying the solitude and responsibility of standing guard. It made her feel useful, capable qualities her father had worked hard to convince her she lacked. Dawn came with a whisper of pink and gold on the eastern horizon. As promised, Patience woke Matthew, who startled awake with his hand immediately going to his gun before he recognized her. "Sorry," he said, relaxing. "Old habits." "No need to apologize," she assured him. "I'm grateful for those habits. They're why I feel safe with you." His eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them in the early morning light. For a moment, Patience thought he might reach for her, but instead he stood and stretched, breaking the spell. "We should get moving if we want to reach Laramie by afternoon," he said, though there was a new warmth in his tone that hadn't been there before. They broke camp efficiently and continued their journey. The day was clear and mild, perfect for traveling, and Patience found herself dreading their arrival in Laramie. With each mile that passed, the end of their time together grew nearer, and the uncertainty of her future loomed larger. "What will you do after you deliver the cattle to Colorado?" she asked as they rode, her arms comfortably around his waist now. Matthew was quiet for a moment before answering. "I've been saving to buy some land. There's a place near Cheyenne I've had my eye on, good water, decent grazing. Not as grand as my father's farm was, but it could be a start." That sounds wonderful, Patience said, trying to ignore the pang of longing his words evoked. A home, a fresh start, exactly what she needed but couldn't imagine for herself. It would be, he agreed, but a ranch is a lot for one man to handle alone. The implication hung in the air between them, neither willing to address it directly. Instead, they rode on in comfortable silence, the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath them creating a shared intimacy that words might have shattered. Laramie appeared on the horizon shortly after midday, a sprawling collection of buildings nestled in the valley. Even from a distance, Patience could see it was larger than any town she'd visited before, with proper streets and two-story buildings lining what must be the main thoroughfare. "It's bigger than I expected," she said, anxiety creeping into her voice. "It's grown since I was here last," Matthew agreed. "The railroads brought a lot of new folks." As they rode into town, Patience was overwhelmed by the activity: wagons rumbling down the street, people bustling in and out of shops, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, and the general hum of a thriving community. After the isolation of her father's cabin, it was both exciting and terrifying. Matthew seemed to sense her unease and guided Copper to a quieter side street, where a modest boarding house stood with a sign advertising rooms for respectable travelers. "Mrs. Holloway runs this place," Matthew explained as he helped Patience down from the horse. "She's stern but fair. Might be able to help you find work, too." Patience nodded, clutching her small bundle of possessions to her chest as Matthew tied Copper to the hitching post and led the way inside. The boarding house was clean and simply furnished, with a small parlor off the entrance hall where an older woman sat mending linens. "Matthew Reed," the woman exclaimed, setting aside her work. "It's been an age since you passed through, Mrs. Holloway." Matthew greeted her with a respectful tip of his hat. "You're looking well." The woman's sharp eyes moved to Patience, assessing but not unkind. "And who's this young lady?" "This is Miss Patience Anderson," Matthew said. "She's looking for work in town and needs a safe place to stay." Mrs. Holloway's gaze softened slightly. "Is that so? Well, as it happens, I could use some help around here. My joints aren't what they used to be, and these stairs get steeper every year." Patience's heart leaped with hope. "I'm a hard worker, madam. I can cook, clean, and mend." Mrs. Holloway nodded approvingly. "Can you read figures, keep accounts?" "Yes, madam. My mother made sure I learned." "Good. I'll provide room and board plus $2 a week to start. If you prove reliable, we'll discuss an increase." She turned to Matthew. "And what about you, Mr. Reed?" Needing a room as well, Matthew shifted uncomfortably. "Just for tonight. I'm heading to the Peterson Ranch tomorrow to start work on their cattle drive." "I'll have Sarah prepare rooms for you both," Mrs. Holloway said, rising from her chair. "Supper's at 6 sharp." With their accommodations settled, Matthew excused himself to stable Copper and check in with his employers. Before leaving, he hesitated, looking at Patience with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'll come back for supper," he promised. "We can talk more then." Patience watched him go, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, newer, swelling in her chest. In the span of a day and night, this quiet cowboy had changed the course of her life. Mrs. Holloway showed Patience to a small but clean room on the second floor with a narrow bed, washstand, and a window overlooking the street. "Get settled," the older woman advised. "Then come down to the kitchen. I'll show you what needs doing." Left alone, Patience sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by how quickly her circumstances had changed. Yesterday morning, she'd woken to her father's anger and the certain knowledge that nothing would ever change. Now, she had a room of her own, the promise of honest work, and what about Matthew? She couldn't deny the connection she felt to him, The way his presence made her feel both safe and alive. But he would be gone tomorrow, off to Colorado with the cattle drive, and then to his dream of land near Cheyenne. Sighing, Patience unpacked her few belongings and went downstairs to begin her new life, trying not to think about how temporary some parts of it might be. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of baking bread. Mrs. Holloway put Patience to work immediately, showing her where everything was kept and explaining the routine of the boarding house. By the time 6 o'clock approached, Patience had helped prepare a hearty supper of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple cobbler for the half-dozen boarders who resided there. Matthew arrived precisely at 6, having bathed and changed his clothes. His hair was still damp, curling slightly at the nape of his neck, and he'd shaved, revealing a strong jawline that his trail stubble had partially hidden. Patience felt her breath catch at the sight of him, so different yet unmistakably the same man who had rescued her. Throughout supper, they exchanged glances across the table as the other boarders engaged in lively conversation about local politics and the upcoming town dance. When the meal was finished, Patience helped clear the dishes, conscious of Matthew watching her move about the dining room. "Would you care to take a walk?" he asked when she finally finished her duties. "It's a fine evening." Mrs. Holloway, overhearing, gave a knowing smile but merely said, "Be back by 9, Miss Anderson. I lock the doors promptly." The streets of Laramie were quieter now, with most businesses closed for the day. A few saloons spilled light and piano music onto the boardwalks, but Matthew steered them toward a small park where a few benches offered a place to sit beneath cottonwood trees. "Mrs. Holloway seems pleased with you already," he commented as they settled on a bench. Patience smiled. "She's been kind. The work isn't so different from what I did at home, but the company is much better." "I'm glad," Matthew said, his voice sincere. "I worried about leaving you here, but it seems you've landed on your feet." The mention of his departure sent a pang through Patience's chest. "When do you leave?" "First light," he said, regret evident in his tone. "The drive to Colorado will take about 3 weeks if the weather holds." Patience nodded, looking down at her hands folded in her lap. "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done." "There's no need for thanks," Matthew said softly. "I only did what any decent man would do." "We both know that's not true," Patience countered. "Most would have ridden past, minding their own business." Matthew was quiet for a moment. "Maybe, but I couldn't, the moment I heard." He trailed off, then seemed to gather himself. "Patience, I know we've only known each other a short time, but I feel like—" He was interrupted by the sound of angry shouts from down the street. Both turned to see a commotion outside one of the saloons, and Patience's blood ran cold when she recognized the slurred voice cutting through the night. "Where is she? Where's my daughter?" Jeremiah Anderson's distinctive bellow carried clearly to where they sat. Somebody in this God-forsaken town must have seen her. Matthew was immediately on his feet, positioning himself protectively in front of Patience. "Your father," he said, his voice tight. "How did he know to look here?" "Laramie's the nearest town," Patience whispered, trembling despite herself. "He must have guessed." Matthew's hand went to his holster, checking that his revolver was accessible. "We should get you back to the boarding house." But before they could move, Jeremiah spotted them across the street. Even in the dim evening light, Patience could see the rage contorting his features. "There you are, you ungrateful wench," he roared, staggering toward them. Running off with some cowboy trash, Matthew stepped forward, his stance wide and prepared. "Mr. Anderson, you're drunk. Go sleep it off before you do something you'll regret." Jeremiah laughed, an ugly sound. Already done that, raising a daughter who'd shame her mother's memory by running off with the first man to show her attention. It wasn't like that, Patience said, finding her voice despite her fear. He saved me from you, saved you. Jeremiah spat on the ground. I was disciplining my own child, as is my right. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Among them, Patience noticed the sheriff, watching with a careful eye but not yet intervening. Matthew's voice remained calm but carried clearly to everyone present. There's a difference between discipline and abuse, Mr. Anderson. What you were doing crosses that line. You don't tell me how to handle my family, Jeremiah snarled, taking another step forward. His hand moved to his waist, where Patience knew he kept a hunting knife. Pa, please, she pleaded. Just go home. I'm not coming back. The hell you aren't, Jeremiah growled. You're my daughter and you'll do as I say. In a sudden movement, he lunged forward, knife glinting in the lamplight. Matthew reacted instantly, pushing Patience aside while drawing his gun in one fluid motion. He didn't fire, instead using the butt of the revolver to strike Jeremiah's wrist, sending the knife clattering to the street. Jeremiah howled in pain and rage, throwing himself at Matthew with all his drunken strength. They fell to the ground in a tangle of limbs, Jeremiah landing a solid punch to Matthew's jaw before the younger man managed to flip their positions, pinning the older man beneath him. That's enough. The sheriff's voice cut through the commotion as he pushed through the onlookers. Break it up now. Two deputies helped separate the men, holding Jeremiah back as he continued to hurl obscenities. Matthew stood his ground, breathing hard but composed, his split lip the only visible evidence of the brief struggle. What's all this about? The sheriff demanded, looking between them. Before either man could answer, Mrs. Holloway's voice rang out as she made her way through the crowd. Sheriff Miller, that man, she pointed at Jeremiah, has been asking after Miss Anderson, threatening to drag her home against her will. The poor girl's covered in bruises from his discipline. The sheriff's expression hardened as he turned to Patience. Is that true, miss? Patience stepped forward, and in the lamplight, the fading marks on her face and arms were clearly visible. Yes, sir, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. My father has been beating me for years. Mr. Reed intervened when he heard what was happening and brought me to safety. Sheriff Miller studied her for a long moment before nodding. Anderson, you're spending the night in my jail. When you're sober, we'll discuss charges. Charges, Jeremiah spluttered. For disciplining my own daughter, this is outrageous. What's outrageous is a grown man beating a woman half his size, the sheriff countered. Take him away, boys. As the deputies dragged a still protesting Jeremiah toward the jail, the crowd began to disperse, the excitement over for the evening. Mrs. Holloway approached Patience and Matthew, concern etched on her face. Are you both all right? Matthew nodded, dabbing at his bloody lip with a handkerchief. We're fine, madam. Thank you for speaking up. Mrs. Holloway sniffed. I know a bully when I see one. Miss Anderson, you should come back to the house now. You've had quite enough excitement for one day. Patience looked at Matthew, reluctant to leave him. I'll be there shortly, Mrs. Holloway. I'd like a moment with Mr. Reed first. The older woman gave them a knowing look but nodded. 5 minutes, she said firmly before heading back to the boarding house. When they were alone again, Patience turned to Matthew, reaching up to touch his injured lip gently. I'm so sorry, she whispered. This is all my fault. Matthew caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. None of this is your fault, he said firmly. None of it. Patience felt tears welling in her eyes. You were about to say something before we were interrupted. What was it? Matthew's gaze softened as he looked at her. I was going to say that I feel like I've known you much longer than a day. That the thought of riding out tomorrow without knowing when I might see you again sits heavy in my chest. Patience's heart raced. I feel the same way, she admitted. When you leave tomorrow, come with me, Matthew said suddenly, still holding her hand. "Not on the cattle drive, that's no place for you, but wait for me. When I return, we could go to Cheyenne together, start fresh. I know it's fast, maybe too fast, but yes," Patience interrupted, surprising herself with the certainty she felt. "I'll wait for you." Matthew's face broke into a smile despite his split lip. "You will." "I will," she confirmed. "These past 24 hours have shown me more kindness and respect than I've known in years. I don't want to let that go." Mindful of his injury, Matthew leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Patience rose to meet him, their lips touching in a gentle, tentative kiss that held the promise of more to come. "I should get you back to Mrs. Holloway before she sends out a search party," Matthew said when they finally parted, though he made no move to release her hand. Patience nodded, reluctantly stepping back. "Will I see you before you leave in the morning? Count on it," he promised. "I'll come by at first light to say goodbye properly." As they walked back to the boarding house, hand in hand beneath the star-filled Wyoming sky, Patience felt a sense of peace she'd thought forever beyond her reach. Her father's rage couldn't touch her now. The future stretched before her, uncertain but full of possibility. True to his word, Matthew arrived at dawn, his horse saddled and ready for the journey ahead. Mrs. Holloway, showing an unexpected romantic streak, allowed them a private farewell in the parlor. "I'll be back in 3 weeks," Matthew promised, holding both her hands in his. "Sooner if I can manage it. I'll be here," Patience assured him, "learning everything I can from Mrs. Holloway, saving my wages." "When I return," Matthew said, his voice low and earnest, "we'll talk about the future, our future, if you're still of the same mind." Patience smiled, feeling braver and more certain than she ever had. "I will be." Their goodbye kiss was brief, but filled with the same promise as the night before. As Patience watched him ride away, the morning sun casting long shadows across the street, she felt not loss but anticipation. For the first time in her life, she was looking forward rather than simply surviving day to day. The days passed quickly as Patience settled into life at the boarding house. Mrs. Holloway proved to be not only a fair employer but a mentor, teaching Patience the finer points of running a business and managing a household larger than the simple cabin she'd grown up in. Word of Jeremiah Anderson's arrest had spread through town, earning Patience sympathetic glances and kind words from strangers. The sheriff had released him after 2 days with a stern warning and a fine, but Jeremiah had left Laramie without attempting to see his daughter again. Patience felt relief rather than sorrow at his departure. 2 weeks into Matthew's absence, a letter arrived from Cheyenne, carried by a fellow cowboy passing through. In it, Matthew described the cattle drive, the long days, the dust, the camaraderie around the campfire at night, but mostly, he wrote of his thoughts of her and his plans for their future. "I've written to the land agent," one passage read. "The property is still available. There's a small cabin that needs work, but the land is good. I think you'll love the view of the mountains at sunset. I picture you there, sketching the landscape, making the place truly a home." Patience read the letter until she'd memorized every word, carrying it with her like a talisman. In the quiet moments between chores, she found herself dreaming of that cabin, imagining how she might arrange it, what curtains she would sew, how she would plant a garden when spring came. And when Matthew returned exactly 3 weeks after he'd left, the first thing he did was seek her out at the boarding house, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "You're still here," he said, as though he'd half expected her to vanish. "I told you I would be," she replied, her own smile just as bright. That evening, with Mrs. Holloway's blessing, they walked to the same park where they'd been interrupted before. The night was clear, the stars brilliant overhead as Matthew took Patience's hands in his. "These weeks have given me time to think," he began. "About what I want, about what I'm offering you." Patience's heart hammered in her chest. "And what have you decided?" "That I love you," he said simply. "That I want to build a life with you if you'll have me. Not just as a companion or a partner, but as my wife." Tears sprang to Patience's eyes as Matthew dropped to one knee, producing a simple gold band from his pocket. "Patience Anderson, I know we've known each other only a short time, but sometimes life gives you certainty in an instant. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes." As Matthew slid the ring onto her finger, Patience felt the last shadows of her past life receding. The man who had ridden through darkness to shield her had brought light back into her world, a light she now knew would never fade. 4 months later, on a crisp autumn day, they stood together on the porch of their newly purchased cabin near Cheyenne. The repairs were complete, curtains hung in the windows, and a small garden plot was marked out for spring planting. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reid," Matthew said, his arm around his wife's waist as they looked out over the rolling grassland that was now theirs. Patience leaned into his embrace, the gold band on her finger catching the sunset light. "It's perfect," she said, and knew that she meant not just the land or the cabin, but everything, their life together, built on that single moment of courage when a cowboy had refused to ride past a cabin where a young woman needed help. From violence had come tenderness. From fear had come love. From one night of protection had grown a lifetime of devotion. As the sun sank behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Patience sent a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever twist of fate had brought Matthew Reid to her door on that stormy night. In his arms, she had found not just safety, but a future brighter than any she had dared to imagine.